February 1945. The winter roads of northern Germany are white with rime, their edges carved by retreating columns. Trucks grind forward under loads of ammunition and bread, each one a heartbeat of an army that no longer believes in victory. The nearby river is frozen at its banks. The sky hangs still, hard metallic, then the sound arrives. At first a low vibration like a distant storm. The truck drivers glance upward, squinting into a pale sun. The sound multiplies until the air itself trembles. Over the trees, small black dots appear, dozens, then hundreds, sunlight flashing off wings painted with invasion stripes. The American P-47 Thunderbolts dive in from the west, engines roaring, 8 heavy guns glinting beneath each wing. Bomb racks open. A heartbeat later, the road erupts in thunder. A driver throws himself into a ditch as his convoy dissolves into fire and spinning metal. Above, the fighters arc upward again, their radial engines howling triumph and exhaustion at once. Somewhere behind the smoke, a German pilot watches from a powerless airfield, his aircraft grounded for lack of fuel. He whispers the name already passing through the ranks: Fliegender Tod, flying death. The day the Luftwaffe's lifelines would finally be cut had begun. By the opening months of 1945, the war over Europe had reached a strange inversion. The Luftwaffe, the air arm that once brought cities to their knees, was itself choking for air. Germany still possessed hundreds of aircraft, many technically formidable, but few could take off more than once or twice a week. Aviation gasoline had become liquid gold, and the once feared Jagdgeschwader, fighter wings of aces, now sat idle, cannibalizing remaining aircraft for parts. The Allied bombing offensive of the previous year had gutted the Reich's oil refineries, shredded its railways, and scattered its repair depots under mountains of rubble. Each week the German front line retreated, not only from enemies with better numbers, but from the steadily tightening noose of logistics. In such a battlefield, fuel trucks, rail wagons, and horse carts became more valuable than tanks. They kept armies alive or starved them in their absence. That reality reshaped Allied air thinking completely. By late 1944, the U.S. Army Air Forces understood that bombing factory roofs no longer crippled Germany. Its factories were buried, dispersed, or mobile. It was the movement between them that mattered. Destroy the arteries, roads, bridges, railways, and the heart would stop on its own. The need demanded a weapon that could roam like a hawk, dive like a falcon, and survive the maelstrom of ground fire. That weapon was the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. At first glance, the Thunderbolt looked ungainly, big-bellied, wide-winged, a mechanical anvil. But its shape hid genius. Its massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine produced over 2,000 horsepower, and unlike liquid-cooled fighters, it could take bullets through its nose and still fly home. It carried 8 50-caliber machine guns, each with hundreds of rounds. At full charge, a Thunderbolt could pour more lead in a 4-second burst than a Sherman tank's entire ammunition load. Originally designed as a high-altitude interceptor, it found its true calling down low, skimming the treetops with bombs and rockets strapped under its iron wings. It earned nicknames from both sides: Jug, to American pilots for its round, jug-like fuselage; Jabo to German ground troops, a contraction for Jag bomber; fighter bomber, but said with a curse of fear. By mid-1944, the 9th Air Force had refined a doctrine of air interdiction, the deliberate strangling of an enemy's movement. Plans named Transportation Plan, Chattanooga Choo-Choo, and countless daily attack orders covered the maps of Allied operations. Every bridge between Leipzig and the Rhine had been photographed, numbered, and assigned to a squadron. The men who flew the Thunderbolts called themselves mud movers, but the description belied the precision and nerve their missions required. Ground attack work was the most dangerous branch of flying. It demanded altitude low enough to catch telegraph poles in your wings, and speed fast enough to dodge the invisible arcs of 20mm flak bursts. Every successful sortie meant one less German fuel train, one fewer column reaching the front. Every loss reminded pilots how frail even the strongest machine became against the ground's chaos. Among the most disciplined units in that campaign was the 56th Fighter Group, led by Colonel Hubert Zemke, a thin, analytical Missourian whose insistence on aggressive yet measured flying built one of the highest-scoring groups in the theater. His P-47s, nicknamed Zemke's Wolfpack, exemplified what American air power had become by 1945. Organized ferocity backed by astonishing industrial depth. Germany, in contrast, was attempting to defend its skies with smoke and promises. Jet fighters like the Me-262 dazzled the imagination, but so few existed that they were irrelevant against the daily tide of Allied sorties. Meanwhile, the traditional Messerschmitts and Focke-Wulfs burned through whatever aviation spirit remained. The Luftwaffe's shrinking fuel pools had an unintended consequence. Experienced pilots could not be replaced. Each lost ace was a wound that never closed, and training schools fell apart for lack of gasoline to even start engines. By February 1945, roads became Germany's bloodstream and its weakness. Convoys moved mostly by night, creeping along frozen lanes under blackout curtains. Trains rolled only through fog. Horse-drawn supply carts, relics of 1917, filled the gaps between panzers built for a modern war. And on those same roads, in the early half-light of short winter days, Allied reconnaissance aircraft marked coordinates, sketching targets for what would come next, a storm designed not to destroy an army, but to erase its movement. That storm had a name, Operation Clarion, and its spearhead would be the Thunderbolt, flying lower, faster, and more mercilessly than ever before. In February 1945, Allied intelligence produced a grim but simple report. Germany's logistics still functioned barely. Despite the bombed-out cities and wrecked bridges, the enemy kept fighting because trains and trucks still limped between shattered depots. To end the war in months rather than years, those fragments of movement had to be obliterated. The plan took shape within both the 8th and 9th Air Forces. It was codenamed Operation Clarion, a word borrowed from the medieval trumpet that called soldiers to battle. The goal was total disruption. No engine, railcar, bridge, or telegraph post left intact across all of Nazi Germany. For 2 specific days, February 22nd and 23rd, the sky would become a weapon of paralysis. The figures staggered even hardened strategists. More than 9,000 aircraft, including heavy bombers, medium attack planes, and hundreds of P-47 Thunderbolts and P-51 Mustangs, would strike 2,500 objectives simultaneously. It was designed as a coordinated hurricane. High-altitude bombers would hit rail yards and marshalling points. Beneath them, Thunderbolts would roam free, hunting locomotives, trucks, convoys, even lone motorcycles carrying dispatches. To Allied planners, this wasn't brutality. It was mathematics. Shells, food, and oil were what kept the Third Reich's army standing. Cut those, and the soldiers themselves would collapse without a last decisive battle. For P-47 pilots, Clarion promised exhaustion before triumph. They flew from muddy airstrips in France, Belgium, even forward bases in the Netherlands, enduring sleet and fog that grounded less rugged aircraft. Maintenance crews worked through nights lit by dim lanterns, stripping ice off wings with numb hands, patching bullet holes with sheet metal and tape. The Thunderbolt's radial engine was brutally loud but forgiving. It could swallow flak fragments and keep climbing. That toughness would prove vital when half the targets lay inside the overlapping cones of Germany's anti-aircraft batteries. Every pilot carried the same briefing outline: sweep from point A to B, attack at opportunity, and ensure nothing on wheels kept moving. Cameras mounted under the fuselage would record strikes for assessment later. In practice, missions became chaos shaped by instinct. At dawn on February 22nd, thick fog still sat over much of Western Europe. P-47 groups took off blind through thin corridors of light, their propellers slicing the cloud tops. Above Germany, the fog cleared, revealing hundreds of smoke plumes where earlier bombing runs were already tearing rail junctions apart. The fighters broke into pairs, spreading across the landscape like angry hornets. At 400 miles per hour, pilots spotted targets through split-second flashes of silver. Truck cabs, oil drums, the curves of locomotives racing for tunnels. They struck in lines so low they could see startled drivers leap from cabins before the road vanished beneath explosions. The Thunderbolt's 8 50 cal machine guns shredded even armored vehicles. Incendiary tracers ripped through fuel convoys, turning winter fields into sudden firestorms. For German soldiers accustomed to shelter from bombs, the experience was new and intimate, an enemy appearing out of trees with the precision of a hunter. Survivors began using a single phrase over radio calls: Fliegender Tod, flying death. Reports from the ground mirror the disbelief. In war diaries recovered later, Wehrmacht officers wrote of roads of fire, horses burning, and planes roaring at rooftop height. One logistics officer near Bielefeld recorded that his entire column was destroyed within 5 minutes by low-flying fighters. The air is lost again. At the same time, the Luftwaffe tried to respond. Scattered interception units, flying depleted Mi-109s or FW-190s, scrambled without coordination. Communications interference and fuel starvation crippled even those efforts. Many aircraft lifted off only to find themselves unable to reach combat zones before fire warning lights forced them back down. For every German sortie, 10 Thunderbolts prowled unopposed. Inside Allied command posts, teletypes clicked with success reports. Bridges erased. Rails twisted like ribbon. Convoys gone silent. In just 48 hours, Clarion achieved what months of strategic bombing had not. It silenced the countryside. Civilians watched both awed and horrified as the thunder rolled away. Freight wagons burned beside church towers. Roads shimmered with heat and telephone poles snapped like matchsticks. By nightfall, trains no longer moved west of the Weser. For American pilots returning to base, adrenaline mixed with fatigue. They had flown 4, sometimes 5 sorties in a day. Bullet-scarred Thunderbolts lined the hard stands, engines still ticking from heat. Mechanics wiped soot off fuselage numbers and painted mission tallies on noses already blackened from smoke. The sense spread that Germany's war machine had finally been struck at its spine, not its shield. Yet the skies would tell the deeper truth only. After daylight returned, when reconnaissance photographs revealed an entire continent of stationary trains. The destruction they recorded marked the transition from dominance to inevitability, and within that transition, the Thunderbolt became an icon not just of superiority, but of annihilating reach, the machine that turned the sky from struggle to certainty. The emotional dimensions behind that assault, the men in the cockpits, the nerves, the disbelief, the engineering that made such feats possible, would reveal the human machinery behind the metal. That's where the next part of this story begins. For the pilots of the P-47, victory never looked clean. It looked like black columns of smoke stretching to the horizon. It smelled of oil and burned rubber. When men describe the Thunderbolt, they rarely talk about glory. They talk about noise. The cockpit of a running jug was less a workspace than a vibrating furnace of sound. The Pratt & Whitney R-2800 radial thrashed like a mechanical heart, too powerful for its own veins. Vibration rattled teeth and instruments. Sweat froze in the February air that leaked through panel seams. Pilots wore scarves not for romance but to catch the droplets of oil that sprayed from the joints. They were young, often just over 20, but by 1945, their eyes looked twice that age. Sorties came 4 to 5 times a day. Ground crews pulled empty machine gun belts out of wings, rolled new ones in, topped tanks, and pushed the next pilot down the runway. No one spoke much, not before takeoff, not after landing. The smell of hot engines became the scent of existence. Many pilots described an odd calm right before diving on convoys. The world narrowed to crosshairs and rhythm. Line up, squeeze trigger, feel recoil, pull up before fire. Nothing else existed until you glimpsed an enemy driver tumble from a burning cab or a horse rear in panic. Those split seconds stayed imprinted longer than medals or promotions. When they wrote home, they avoided details. Plenty of work today. Slept an hour. It was perhaps their only way to make sense of the scale of what they were doing. The P-47 Thunderbolt didn't win affection through elegance. It earned loyalty through survival. Pilots joked that the jug could dive into a barn and come out the other side still flying. Its design philosophy was uniquely American. If you can't avoid damage, endure it. The radial engine gave less power-to-weight ratio than the Mustang's sleek V12, but it removed one fatal point of failure. A bullet through the nose meant nothing more than a smudge of oil. No coolant to leak, no lines to cut. The fuselage was a tub of steel around the pilot. Even flak bursts seldom crushed the canopy cage. Each wing carried 4 Browning M250 calibrate machine guns. Together they could fire roughly 100 rounds a second, enough to drill through locomotives. Beneath the belly, racks handled 2 500 or 1,000-pound bombs or 10 rockets for closer work. Fully loaded, a P-47 weighed over 8 tons, making it one of the heaviest single-engine fighters ever to fly. At the throttle, that weight felt solid, Comforting. Pilots said it flew like a safe with wings. Dive controls locked around 500 mm, but a practiced hand could dive through flak, release ordnance, and level out below treetops. No other fighter of the era tolerated that abuse daily. For ground crews, the Thunderbolt was labor disguised as metal. They tightened bolts shaken loose by 8-hour sorties, patched holes big enough to slide a jacket through, and filled bullet dents with rivets until the surface rippled like corrugated tin. Each campaign stretched machines beyond design limits, but the jugs kept coming back. Even weather seemed to respect the aircraft's sturdiness. Frost would cling to its wings as ice crystals, dissipating only at climb-out, leaving contrails that traced a script of dominance in the cold morning sky. For the Wehrmacht on the ground, February 1945 brought not uniform defeat but a sense of disorientation. Old rules no longer applied. In earlier years, soldiers could look up and judge. A few bombers meant hide. Artillery would resume after. By 1945, there was no pattern. The sky could erupt at any moment. Convoy commanders began dispersing vehicles at 50-meter intervals simply to reduce the size of fireballs. Even this measure failed. The Thunderbolts worked in teams, radioing train spotted or movement north of forest, diving one after another until the sky looked like a permanent tracer storm. For tankers and drivers, there was no answer. Divisional flak, 20 mm and 37-meter guns, could fill the air with steel, but rarely hit anything moving that fast and low. The Thunderbolt came in as a streak, released bombs, and vanished behind the next ridge. Soldiers described hearing incoming aircraft only after the first explosion. In towns like Münster, Halberstadt, and Hildesheim, refugees spoke of metal storms that lasted hours. The Luftwaffe couldn't intercept. Fuel reserves prioritized evacuations and essential reconnaissance. Outnumbered fighters that did lift off were immediately outclimbed or outgunned. Pilots nursing failing engines circled at distance, powerless. Inside the Luftwaffe's command huts, officers used the word Verkehrslähmung, traffic paralysis, to describe their own territory. What had once been orderly columns across rail grids became scattered dots hiding in woods. Supply depots relocated nightly. Trucks painted green over gray, mule teams sent through fields. It was improvisation in the face of inevitability. German morale cracked from silence rather than chaos. For 8 hours after Operation Clarion's opening, most radios went dead. Headquarters waited for reports that never came. Only smoke columns on the horizon told the story. That was when someone whispered the phrase that would spread through surviving units by the next morning. Fliegender Tod, flying death. 2 words that captured what the monster in the sky had become. Pure, indifferent obliteration. For the Germans watching their convoys vanish and for the pilots flying those missions until their eyes burned, the war had become a contest of exhaustion and engineering, a duel on unequal terms where courage was constant, but hope was not. From this mixture of human bravery, mechanical force, and collapsing opposition came a new way to wage air warfare, where the fighter no longer protected something but destroyed everything that moved. The next angles will reveal the tactics, psychology, and moral shadow of that change. The idea that fighters could control ground battlefields had begun as an improvisation. By February 1945, it had matured into a system. The 9th Air Force's tactical air commands learned to choreograph. Thunderbolts like an orchestra striking the same note repeatedly across Germany's arteries. The method was called armed reconnaissance. Pilots took off in pairs or fours, assigned a broad region rather than fixed coordinates. Once airborne, they hunted anything that moved. Bridges, trains, and power substations were high-value targets, but so were dairy wagons that might conceal fuel drums or motorbikes carrying messages. Machine-gunned road junctions became unpassable. Strafed locomotives turned their own twisted boilers into barricades. The P-47's ruggedness allowed it to fly through curtain fire when medium bombers would have disintegrated. Crews exploited this advantage mercilessly. They learned to attack along sun angles that blinded enemy gunners, to dive from upsun and pull out just above streams to cool engines. The landscape itself became their ally. Each Thunderbolt operated with near-naval firepower on wings. Rockets for bridges, bombs for columns, machine guns for survivors. Within weeks, an entire vocabulary grew in mission logs. Rail busting, bridge busting, rhubarb, cab rank. Ground forces adapted signals to request instant support. Colored smoke grenades thrown forward would call. Thunderbolts down like artillery summoned by color code. It was a revolution of connectivity and chaos. Radio frequencies between armor and pilots standardized. A tank under fire in the Eifel could report coordinates and within minutes hear friendly engines screaming overhead. The enemy could no longer separate land from air. They were now a single integrated battlefield. German anti-aircraft units, formidable in earlier years, found their fixed gun pits irrelevant as P-47s shifted altitude and direction each run. Rolling convoys meant mobile flak, but trucks couldn't mount enough firepower to fend off dozens of plunging attacks every hour across entire provinces. By late winter, logistics officers admitted that moving supplies in daylight was suicide. Night or never became the new command, but the Allies planned for that too. Night intruder missions by mosquito bombers followed twilight paths of the Thunderbolts. The result was permanent vulnerability. No hour offered safety. Among Wehrmacht survivors, fear of Thunderbolts crossed into superstition. Drivers claimed they could sense one before it appeared. The air would quiver or dust would stir from still roads. Rumors spread that American pilots used special detection gear to find single trucks by heartbeat or noise. Civilians believed unseen spotters marked moving vehicles with secret light flashes. In truth, the only secret lay in relentless repetition. Allied air patrols blanketed everything. Prisoner interrogations revealed a deeper wound. By 1945, German soldiers no longer cursed Allied aircraft. They pitied themselves instead. "It's foolish to fight God in the sky," one captured Feldwebel said during debrief. For men raised in military certainty, this shift was devastating. Equipment failures could be fixed, miracles could not. For Luftwaffe pilots, watching without power cultivated an agony harder than fear, irrelevance. Grounded on empty airfields, they listened to the thunder above while ration committees debated whether to waste fuel on a training sortie that might never face the enemy. Some flew reconnaissance just to die usefully. In those months, heroism meant fighting physics with empty tanks. The Americans felt none of that invincibility. They respected their targets precisely because they saw what each rocket did. Barns exploding, trucks scattering into flame, sometimes civilians running from wagons mistaken for military use. That knowledge built an unease they seldom voiced. Death, when too constant, became background noise. Pilots joked loudly and drank harder after missions, but many kept count not of sorties, but of columns destroyed. Each tick on a fuselage meant more emptiness below. Nonetheless, the name Flying Death became part of Allied lore too. Grim humor, a mark of effectiveness. It was painted on a few nose panels in chalk, washed away before inspection. Even victory demanded detachment to stay bearable. From a distance, the campaign looked like pure efficiency, destroy supply, end war. But for those who signed each mission order, moral arithmetic weighed as heavily as fuel calculations. With every expansion of target lists, from rail junctions to individual roadsides, the line between strategy and terror blurred. Operation Clarion's planners framed their logic carefully. The Third Reich, they argued, was now a single military machine. Every factory worker, driver, and messenger fed ammunition to the front. Stopping movement meant saving lives in future battles. Yet even the phrasing, "all transportation objectives are hostile," chilled some officers reading it. They knew that rural towns hadn't all surrendered. Refugees still fled eastward from the advancing Soviet armies, shadowing supply trails the air forces now obliterated. Reconnaissance photographs later showed incredible contradictions. One, track of untouched wagons next to a village leveled by chance. Another where pilots had threaded bombs exactly through a narrow bridge span. Human decision in split seconds shaped the fate of thousands. The P-47's precision was terrifying. Flying barely 50 feet off the ground, pilots could aim rockets into a single truck or a trench entrance. But at that range, reflex ruled conscience. A flash, a pull, a climb, and the ground was already smoke and noise. Historians decades later would divide opinion, some calling Clarion a masterpiece of destruction that hastened surrender, others a final orgy of excess already unnecessary. Yet even critics admitted the reality. By turning speed and reach into instantaneous ground control, the Allies revealed the future of air power. War fought through denial of movement, not capture of space. When the Thunderbolts landed on the evening of February 23rd, their pilots carried not trophies but exhaustion. The landscape below them was too silent, too still. Bridges burned like red scars across rivers. Freight yards glowed even at dusk. Commands promised praise. Airmen promised only to sleep. What had begun as a fight for the sky had ended as a destruction of roads, and with it, the dismantling of Germany's capacity to breathe. From that stillness rose the moment of recognition. This was more than another operation. It was the day a nation's arteries were severed, and its pilots called the enemy's machines by a single name that needed no translation: Flying Death. The next chapter would show how that name was earned fully, in the climax of Clarion, where the sky itself dragged the war to its end. February 22, 1945, dawned under a dim haze across Central Europe. The last winter of the war had turned fields to crusted snow and rivers to narrow seams of ice. In the brief interval between night curfews and daylight alarms, convoys began to move. Gray trucks, horse carts, fuel wagons threaded along the valleys of the Ruhr and Hesse. Few imagined that by noon there would be no such thing as a safe road. At 8:30 a.m., Allied radio networks came alive. Thousands of aircraft already circled assembly zones from Belgium to northern France. Operations officers repeated the same order: Clarion is go. Soon the very geography of Germany disappeared beneath the density of formation trails. High above 20,000 feet, B-17s and B-24s lumbered toward rail centers like Bodenwerder, Halle, and Kassel. Below, the faster P-47 Thunderbolts fanned outward in packs of 4, each carrying 2 500-pound bombs and full drums of 50-caliber ammunition. The Thunderbolts of the 56th and 362nd Fighter Groups led the first wave. Flying at treetop level, their propeller discs blurred into silver halos. Couriers on the ground heard the noise seconds before the attack. At Hamelin, a freight train carrying fuel had just cleared the station when the first bomb struck the bridge ahead. The locomotive braked, wheels screaming. Seconds later, the second element appeared from the west and opened fire. Camera footage, recovered later, shows the rails flying apart, boxcars rolling sideways, the air full of flaming debris. Within 2 hours, the same scene repeated across hundreds of kilometers. Railways vanished under craters. Roads convulsed into dust. Columns bound for the Eastern Front stopped dead near Magdeburg, their haulers overturned, horses lying amid twisted harness. Every time a surviving crew tried to clear a route, another squadron arrived, drawn by smoke. At 10 a.m., weather opened over the Harz Mountains. New groups dove through gaps in the cloud base. Pilots described it as like falling into a cauldron of lightning. The landscape was already burning, but they attacked anyway, strafing through their own turbulence. For the Luftwaffe, the chaos was beyond comprehension. Radar plots became incoherent, frequencies filled with partial warnings. Hundreds, low over the forest, they're everywhere. Out of 150 aircraft ordered to intercept, fewer than 40 lifted from the ground. Most couldn't reach altitude before towers ordered them back for fuel. Those who tried found themselves diving by instinct through a mesh of contrails and flak smoke, unable to separate friend from foe. One of the few veteran aces still flying, Oberleutnant Hans Weich, later recalled his single sortie that day. I saw a black line moving across a valley and then realized, horrified, it was one long column of trucks already burning. Every few seconds something exploded, a tank, a trailer, a man, and above them more aircraft. You could not tell sky from fire. The American pilots saw the same, but from another angle. Lieutenant Jack Majors of the 365th Group described through combat film commentary, you'd hit a target and pull up into sunlight. Down below, smoke from someone else's pass stretched for miles. Once you're up there, it hits you. There's nothing left to shoot that isn't already burning. Clarion had achieved what planners feared and desired in equal measure: total overcoverage. High, medium, and low sectors converged so completely, that aircraft risked colliding with their own side. Controllers tried to stagger timing, but radio interference turned the situation into organized mayhem. By noon, 5,000 sorties had been flown. The Ruhr Basin, once mapped in detail for industrial bombing, disappeared beneath a solid haze of dust. Photographs later taken show only two colors, black and white, track and scar. German civilian reports that survived censorship paint the impact from inside. A farmer near Gütersloh wrote, "The ground shook, though there was no front near." The sky was the front. A railway dispatcher at Kassel recorded at 11:37 a.m. "Lines cut in every direction. We can neither send nor receive trains. No telegraph, no signal, nothing." His log ends at that sentence. The building destroyed minutes later. That collapse spread outward like infection. Telephones failed as wires were severed. Petrol dumps detonated, sending geysers of flame high enough to be photographed from 20 miles away. Armored units stalled mid-march because tankers never arrived. Infantry at the Rhine bridgeheads waited for supplies that no longer existed. By late afternoon, Allied pilots had exhausted their targets. Thunderbolts returned heavy with the smell of spent ammunition and engine oil. Landing zones turned into queues of blackened jugs, wingtips riddled by flak, canopies streaked with the residue of smoke they'd flown through. For those who climbed out of their cockpits, the world was strangely quiet. Behind them, Europe still burned. Ahead, mechanics already rolled out fresh fuel drums for the next wave. The day was not over. Clarion's plan demanded continuity. Nightfall offered no reprieve. When the horizon darkened and temperature dropped again below freezing, crews rearmed under flare light, their faces hollow in amber glow. Somewhere beyond the Rhine, German officers stared west, realizing that movement itself had become impossible. In that moment, the Luftwaffe's ancient promise to control the air died completely. What remained of it would try one more desperate act when dawn returned. That attempt and its final failure would seal the Thunderbolt's legend and the meaning of flying death. Night fell early on February 22nd. Over blackened rail lines and smoldering roads, the glow of burning convoys replaced moonlight. In hundreds of towns, the electric grid had collapsed. The fire itself became the only illumination. Civilians stared upward, believing the attacks finished until the earth trembled again with engines. Clarion's second day was beginning before the first had truly ended. At midnight, Allied night fighter patrols scoured the German interior. Mosquito bombers with radar eyes mapped surviving rail movement. Their transmissions bled into command centers in France, where staff officers marked fresh coordinates. Hours before dawn, those signals were already in the headsets of P-47 crews warming engines beside wingtip lanterns. The generator sputtered, chocks were pulled, and steel wings rolled toward darkness. The morning of February 23rd was colder, the sky clearer, the Allied intent mercilessly precise. The Luftwaffe's higher staffs, desperate to stem the devastation, ordered every flyable interceptor into the air. Me-109s, FW-190s, even a handful of jet-powered Me-262s. For the first time in months, German pilots took off en masse, not to win, but to show Germany still fought back. Their target map was blank. The enemy could appear anywhere, and when it did, it appeared everywhere. By 8 a.m., new formations of Thunderbolts had crossed within sight of Hanover. German fighters tried to climb through the bomber stream, but Clarion's pattern was unpredictable. Some P-47s cruised at treetop level, others at 10,000 feet, all in constant motion. Luftwaffe pilots found themselves diving blindly, pursued by invisible fire from below as well as above. Above Münster, witnesses on the ground reported an aerial ballet without choreography, contrails twisting inside smoke columns, flak bursts bursting within them, and bright streaks plummeting toward the ground, fighters falling faster than parachutes could open. One veteran FW-190 pilot, Karl Heinemann, later described the futility. "We climbed to stop the low flyers," he said, "but their friends waited higher. Every time you leveled out, there was one behind you. It was like fighting a wall of thunder." That thunder was literal. The P-47's radial roar filled the sky, echoed by ordnance detonations below. Squadrons hit secondary targets, canal bridges, ferry crossings, and railway batteries hidden in woods. It became hunting routine: follow smoke, follow fear. In a single sortie, the 405th and 406th Fighter Groups destroyed more than 50 locomotives between Kassel and Bielefeld. Each explosion starved entire divisions waiting for shells near the Rhine. By midday, aerial photographs confirmed 8 main rivers effectively severed along their transport lines. For German ground crews refueling Messerschmitts, the disaster unfolded live around them. Fuel trucks ignited before hoses connected. Spare parts vaporized in open crates. Runways cratered before aircraft reached speed. Pilots circling for takeoff saw their own fields bloom into fire. Among them, the phrase totale Lähmung, complete paralysis, replaced radio discipline. Yet some attacks met fierce resistance. Over the Thuringian forest, heavy flak batteries hidden among pines finally managed to bring down several Thunderbolts. Pilots who survived crashes in enemy territory were lynched by locals. Their aircraft charred beyond identification. No glory softened the edges that day. Only extremes of luck decided who returned. At Allied headquarters, radio codes confirmed the magnitude of success. A single 36-hour period had destroyed or disabled over 600 locomotives, 6,000 rail cars, and untold trucks. Electricity grids flickered out across the North German plain. From Hamburg to Augsburg, every line of communication was broken. While Clarion's high-level planners tracked tonnage of targets, the pilots in the field felt something simpler, exhaustion that bordered on despair. Victorious exhaustion. We didn't see our enemy's eyes anymore, one flight leader wrote in his diary that night. Only the smoke he left behind. Back in the ruins of outbound airfields, stranded Luftwaffe personnel finally received the reports that confirmed their defeat. The patchwork of independent fighter wings had vanished beneath logistic collapse. Fuel stocks for me. 262 jets were adequate for barely 10 sorties. Piston fighters had less. Ground commanders declared that remaining air defense would switch to rifles and courage alone. Some junior officers proposed reorganizing into all-jet squadrons, clinging to technology as a last hope. Their superiors shook heads. There was no fuel even to transfer the aircraft. One mechanic scribbled bitterly on a hangar wall, "Wir können nur noch sterben langsam." We can only die slowly now. Meanwhile, Allied reconnaissance aircraft filmed the devastation Clarion had left, twisting plumes coiling across half of Germany. Entire valleys appeared fogged by ash, intersections marked by wagon carcasses and shattered horses. The film reels would later circulate among headquarters in France, proof that a nation's mobility could be erased from the air in 2 days. By evening, Thunderbolts returned to their scattered airstrips one last time. Pilots taxied through puddles of melted frost, engines coughing after days of continuous strain. Ground crews counted holes, replaced spent barrels, and stared at the heap of collected shell casings gleaming like brass gravel. Clarion ended officially at 6 p.m. on February 23rd. The mission summaries praised precision, courage, efficiency. None included the other words veterans later used: silence, fatigue, disbelief. In their debriefs, many said the same phrase: there was nothing left to hit. That emptiness told the truth. Germany's armies were still fighting in the field, but they were fighting on air and memory alone. Trucks could not move. Rails no longer existed. The Luftwaffe, once master of skies, could not even supply itself with fuel to surrender. The Thunderbolts had earned the name both sides now used without irony: flying death. Not monstrous, not cruel, only inevitable. And as smoke from those 2 days drifted west on the cold wind, commanders on the ground began to plot the advance that would enter the Rhine valleys unopposed. The air had done the work of armies. The physical battle was finished. The aftermath, its consequences, statistics, and moral weight would define how history remembered the machines that had ended movement itself. By dawn on February 24th, 1945, 2 things had changed forever: the map of Germany and the meaning of air superiority. Operation Clarion had ended. Its echo did not. Across thousands of square kilometers, rails glistened like broken wires. Bridges dangled half-destroyed over cloudy rivers. Smoke drifted low across farmland where convoys had ceased to exist. The statistics filtered through Allied intelligence rooms first, neat tables that hid chaos. In 48 hours, the U.S. 8th and 9th Air Forces had flown over 15,000 sorties. Between them, they claimed nearly 700 locomotives destroyed, 24,000 rail cars, and more than 5,000 vehicles rendered useless. Electrical substations, fuel depots, and signal exchanges, every node binding the German interior, lay in ruins. There were still armies on the map, but they no longer connected to each other. For Allied ground commanders preparing the crossing of the Rhine, these numbers were more than impressive. They were liberation in arithmetic. Divisions waiting on the western bank would move into a paralyzed enemy zone. Logistics, the element that had starved Allied offensives for years, now strangled the army that had invented blitzkrieg. The change was visible from the front. In the week that followed Clarion, reconnaissance crews flying their slow reconnaissance lightnings described a stillness unnatural to war. Roads once alive with vehicle traces appeared empty even under cloudbreak. When cars did move, they formed single, hesitant lines between smoking ruins. German troops, now isolated, resorted to bicycles and livestock to move artillery shells to guns. One captured document from Wehrmacht headquarters west, dated February 27, admitted the depth of the paralysis. It read, "Due to loss of rail communications, fuel reserves must serve only immediate battle sectors. Movements across Rhine will depend on horse transport and seizure of local civilian stock." It was effectively an obituary for mobility. The psychological aftermath spread as fast as the physical. German civilians emerging from shelters spoke of road ghosts. Survivors of burned convoys refused to travel during daytime. Entire villages experienced what historians later termed transportophobia, a collective fear of open roads. For the first time in the war, moving was more dangerous than hiding. American Thunderbolt groups rotated back to repair and refit cycles. Pilots slept through daylight for the first time in weeks, their bodies registering exhaustion only after adrenaline receded. Maintenance hangars filled with engines reduced to scrap by overspeed dives. Propeller blades bent into subtle curves like battle ribbons. Each repair became ritual, wiping soot away, counting bullet holes, recording another machine that had returned when physics said it shouldn't. News of Clarion's success swept Allied press rooms, sanitized for headlines. "Flying tank breaks enemy backbone," read one American paper. British correspondents described the event with restrained pride. "The Great Thunderbolt Offensive has put out Germany's lights." Few articles mentioned civilian suffering. Column inches reserved for that belonged to strategy. Inside Germany, however, local newspapers printed what censorship allowed: appeals for patience, promises of new secret jet squadrons, and warnings against stragglers who impede roads. Almost no one believed them anymore. Nothing impeded roads. They were already gone. The Luftwaffe, stripped not only of fuel but of purpose, dwindled into symbol. Its aircraft, perfect in theory, sat gleaming useless under snow and forest clearings. Crews burned parts of them for warmth. Many remaining pilots wrote home only to say they were alive that week. Next week was uncertain. They refused to call it defeat, only standstill. Amid that standstill, Allied planners turned from destruction to occupation. The front lines inched eastward with increasing speed, powered less by tanks than by the emptiness created overhead. General Spaatz described Clarion in his final report as not a battle but a blackout of a nation. Few disagreed. By March, as the Rhine bridge crossings began, Allied convoys roared through the same valleys once ruled by German trucks. Where columns had burned, new ones now advanced. Every destroyed bridge was replaced by a Bailey span under American direction. Roads cleared of wreckage turned paradoxically smoother than before. The machine of conquest had simply changed hands. For pilots and ground crews alike, the victory felt detached, hollow, and awe-inspiring at once. They knew they had removed an enemy's capacity to live in motion. They had seen the concept of blitzkrieg reversed until it collapsed under its own logic. And in the ashes of that logic lay the quiet prelude to victory. Roads silent. Air still. Rivers waiting for the next army to cross. The second phase of aftermath would show how those broken supply lines altered the final months of war. The surrender that followed, and the myths that clung to the Thunderbolt long after its last sortie. March 1945. Germany's armies still fought on paper, but in practice they were stranded in their own country. Allied divisions rolling east from the Rhine moved faster than German commands could even transmit warnings. The phone lines were severed, message couriers trapped behind collapsed bridges, and locomotives without coal stood frozen on their tracks. The disruption Clarion had begun rippled outward in every direction. Fuel stockpiles dwindled to fumes. Some armored units stacked tanks by the roadside, removing batteries before abandoning them. Others resorted to horse carts, an image from 1918 reborn with bitter irony inside an industrial nation. Soldiers once lauded for mechanized blitzkrieg became pedestrians overnight. The Luftwaffe's reaction revealed the final unraveling of discipline. Operational orders for March 10th show the entire Western defense recounting only 259 flyable aircraft across multiple air districts. Of those, barely 130 had aviation fuel for sustained flight. Jet squadrons hoarded secret reserves, but it no longer mattered. The supply routes delivering spare parts were gone. German pilots who climbed into cockpits did so almost ceremonially. Their targets were chosen for emotion rather than logic. A bridge here, a fuel dump there, vengeance played out in miniature. Many never returned, not always because they were shot down, but because there was nowhere functional to land. Meanwhile, Allied Thunderbolt groups continued targeted interdictions, maintaining pressure on what remained of the Reich's skeleton transport network. P-47 engines still rumbled daily across a conquered sky, but missions changed character, from hunting to overwatch, guiding convoys and dropping leaflets above areas that could no longer resist. American pilots saw their own handiwork beneath them. Thin gray ribbons of ash marking former highways, rail cars lying like beads strung across fields, towns oddly quiet, half deserted. Inside Allied command tents, new priorities arose, bridging supply and humanitarian corridors. With enemy movement extinguished, the challenge became moving forward troops through the same terrain they had destroyed. Engineers worked beside wrecks of burned convoys, laying temporary routes while prisoner columns trudged past. When the Rhine was finally crossed near Remagen in mid-March, opposition was fragmented. Commanders on front lines reported units uncontacted and uncoordinated. Many German defenders never knew the battle had shifted miles behind them until Allied armor was visible. Clarion's blindness had become total. Reports from captured officers painted the same picture. One colonel from the 15th Panzer Grenadier Division described screaming engines and unending explosions. It was as if the skies had finally become artillery. We fought shadows. Supply columns never reached us again. Our field kitchens died where they stood. Another, detained at Bielefeld, said simply, "We learned to fear trees, because from the trees came thunder." American generals recognized that precision. Not mass bombardment had sealed the enemy's fate. The phrase tactical air power entered doctrine documents almost immediately. P-47 veterans returning home would later find their aircraft outshined in fame by the sleek P-51 Mustang. But among ground troops, the Jug kept a different prestige, the one that stayed low, took the flak and saved lives. After the war, statistics told the remainder of the story. Germany's last 28th Railway Transport Corps dissolved without formal orders. Army Group B surrendered weeks later with its supply tonnage down 80%. Specialists estimated that the paralysis caused by Clarion shortened the European war by several months. For ordinary Germans, its memory blended with the larger ruin of invasion, one more storm in a long season of fire. Yet veterans on both sides retained respect for the brutal efficiency of the machine that had made it possible. Some captured Luftwaffe men asked to examine a grounded Thunderbolt after surrender, touching its armor like archaeologists studying an artifact of their downfall. Post-war evaluations confirmed what pilots felt instinctively. The P-47 had been too tough to kill, too heavy to replace. Its design philosophy, the idea that aerial dominance depended on endurance more than grace, foreshadowed a new age of jet close support aircraft. From Korea to Vietnam, its descendants carried the same logic forward: survive, strike, protect the ground force. Back where the first strikes of Clarion had scorched the valley roads, spring returned quickly. Farmers unearthed twisted rails to plant wheat between them. Children played beside engine husks half sunk in mud. The war's ruin melted into landscape. Only when one looked from the air, years later, from the nose of a peacetime survey plane, could the strange geometry of destruction still be seen. Grids of craters silently spelling the shape of an empire's collapse. The Western Allies called it victory by air. The Germans who endured it called it death without warning. Both names were true, and both belonged to the same moment when the sky over Europe decided the outcome of everything beneath it. Out of that smoke and exhaustion came reflection, the understanding that technology and logistics had eclipsed heroism itself, and that war would never again depend on courage alone. When the guns finally went quiet and the smoke lifted from Germany's valleys, the world understood that air power had changed the nature of war. The P-47 Thunderbolt, that vast armored engine of noise, had done more than destroy an enemy. It had erased the idea that courage and numbers could overcome logistics. For the first time, victory belonged to whoever could make the other side stand still. Historians would later name it interdiction warfare. But to those who had watched it unfold, the truck drivers frozen on roads, the farmers whose fields turned into craters, the pilots counting the seconds until flak found them, it felt simpler and more terrible. It was proof that the modern battlefield no longer had boundaries. Roads, factories, skies, they all merged into one relentless system of destruction. The men who flew the Thunderbolts rarely called themselves heroes. They were craftsmen inside a storm, focused, methodical, numbed by repetition. They did what their time demanded, and in doing it, stripped myth away from combat. War had always been about movement. They proved that stopping movement could end it faster than any battle of armies. For the Luftwaffe, the lesson was equally absolute. The age of daring duels between fighter aces was gone. Futility replaced gallantry. Their best pilots could not fight a machine that turned the sky into artillery, the weather into weapon, and every road into a target grid. When peace arrived, the noise of the Thunderbolt faded, but its shadow stretched across every new design that followed. Jet fighters and attack planes would inherit its blunt philosophy: survive the first hit, strike where it hurts most, keep the pressure until the enemy ceases to move. And so, in the closing months of the most mechanized war in history, one sound defined the end: the radial roar of the flying death. Its echo still drifts through the black and white reels, columns burning, bridges gone, the air trembling above a defeated land. The people who heard that sound never forgot it. To them, the line between machine and fate had disappeared. The Thunderbolts had not merely cut supply lines. They had severed the thread that once bound power to Earth, and in that severing, World War II reached its final inevitable stillness.